Okay, so my topic today is about whether there is poverty in Singapore. And I think before we start off to ask if there is poverty in Singapore, we first need to understand what is poverty, how does it look like. So let me bring through you what poverty could mean. So for example, could it be lacking in shelter, not having a roof, a home over our head? Could it be lacking in food, not being able to know when your next meal will come from, whether you can afford to buy your next meal? Could it be lacking in medical attention, so not being able to go to the doctor when you're ill, not being able to seek for treatment? Could it be lacking in education, not being able to send your kids to school, not being able to allow them to have a better future for themselves? Or could it be about lacking in jobs, not having a job whereby you can go to, not having a job whereby you can earn money for yourselves or your family? So how does poverty look like? And if poverty are all these above mentioned items, then it's very easy for us living in Singapore to quickly conclude that maybe poverty doesn't really exist in Singapore, because in Singapore we have subsidized housing, we have rental flats for the poor people. People in Singapore, we get to eat. Medical treatment is not denied for anyone, even if they can't afford it. Children all have to go to schools, and of course we have one of the lowest unemployment rate among developed nations in Singapore. So if poverty is all these things, then does it really exist in Singapore? I'd like to give a definition about what poverty is. There's basically two types of poverty we can look at. One is absolute poverty, and then another is relative poverty. So absolute poverty is about not having enough money to afford the basic necessities in life to be able to survive. So that means not having enough money to buy food, not having enough money to have a home, not having enough money for transportation, for clean water, to send your kids to school. So that refers to absolute poverty. And of course, absolute poverty line differs from countries to countries. So in Singapore, that will be more expensive because food is more expensive, because shelter is more expensive. Relative poverty is a little different from absolute poverty. Relative poverty tends to be used more in developed nations such as Singapore. So relative poverty isn't just about having enough money to buy the basic items for survival in the country. It is also about having enough money so that you're not excluded from society. So what does that mean? For developed nation like Singapore, our economy progresses very quickly. As it progresses, if your income is unable to keep up with the progress of the country, you get left behind. So take for example, 40 years ago when my dad first started going to work, he was earning about $300 per month, and at those times that was enough for him to buy the basic things in life. It's not a luxurious lifestyle he lived, but it's enough for him to continue to stay connected with his friends even at that kind of salary. Today, that will not be enough for him, for example, to buy a laptop so that he can do his work, so that he can go to school with a laptop to do his assignment. It will not be enough to get a phone, not just any handphone, but a smartphone, so that you can stay connected through WhatsApp to your friends, to your colleagues, more importantly to your bosses as well. And of course, none of these things will be useful without internet access, without wireless connection, because we need the internet to stay connected to our friends through emails, through WhatsApp. So relative poverty really is about adjusting, having enough money to adjust with the growing trends of a country. How does absolute poverty look like in Singapore? In 2011, the Department of Statistics actually measured that for a household income, for a Singapore household to afford the basic necessities in life, we are looking at about $1,250. That's for a household of 4 persons, so that's about $300 per person. I think most of us will agree that that's not a lot of money, so that's what is needed. Interestingly, 10 to 12% of Singapore households actually fall under this level. So in totality, we're looking at about 400 to 500,000 people who are not able, who are struggling to be able to afford the basic necessities in life. What about relative poverty? In many developed nations, one of the benchmarks to calculate relative poverty is to look at the median income of people in the country and then to take a percentage of it, a fraction of that median income. So in many countries, we are usually looking at about 40 to 50% of median income. So how does that translate into Singapore's now context? We're looking at about $3,000 per month per household as a mark for relative poverty. About 23 to 26% of Singapore households actually fall under this income level. And that translates into about 1 to 1.1 million people in Singapore who might be at the risk of falling behind if they're not able to keep up with society expectations. So my question now is poverty simply a matter of being poor, just not having enough money in life to be able to get the things you need? I like to draw a comparison between poverty and having a fever. So as all of us know, when we have a fever, we go to the doctor. Sometimes the doctor will tell us that you have a fever, but it's not, your illness is not the fever by itself. Rather, your fever is the symptom shown by some other illnesses that you might have. It's a body reaction to some other illnesses. This could be a bacterial infection, this could be a virus. That's not to say that a fever isn't important or isn't dangerous. If you have a high fever, you need to seek treatment for it. You need to be hospitalized because it could be life-threatening if it's not treated. So a fever is dangerous, but it's not the root cause of your illness. As doctors, sometimes when the doctor diagnoses us, some of the common flus, it naturally goes away. Sometimes the diagnosis is something that just requires treatment. There's a root problem towards all these things. So what are some of the possible root problems of poverty? Here are some possible root problems: drug abuse, gambling addictions. It's covered, but that means marital issues, marital problems in a family, alcoholism, and of course a lack of education. So if you talk to any welfare workers, any social workers in Singapore, the problem of being poor is usually closely linked with some, if not a few of these above mentioned problems. For example, statistics from Methodist Welfare Services showed that among the poorest income group of people in Singapore, only about 1% of them have a qualification of a diploma and above. So clearly education has some link towards the problem of poverty, about the problem of being poor. Likewise, about 41% of households that are among the poorest in Singapore have only a qualification level of a PSLE and below. So that means they only have education up to the age of 12 or even lesser than that. So clearly education is important if we were to solve the problem of poverty. Other statistics also revealed that about 40% of these people suffer from sicknesses and diseases. So that makes sense because if they're sick, it's difficult for them to get a job. It's difficult for them to keep a job, and they have a lot of medical bills that they also have to cope with and they have to pay for. 39% of them suffer from anxiety and depression matters, and 18% of them deal with family members who are in jail. Here's the thing about these problems that I just highlighted. They are not problems that are exclusive to the poor. Normal people like us, we might have some of these problems. People we know might have some of these problems. Famous people have these problems all the time. We read about them in the tabloids. And rich people have these problems all the time. Take for example, Oscar de la Hoya. He's one of my favorite boxers. He retired a few years ago. Oscar de la Hoya was a middleweight boxing champion, a very successful boxer, a very successful businessman. He has a net worth of about USD 175 million. So this is a guy that people look up to. Boxing fans look up to him. Mexicans, he's a Mexican, Mexicans look up to him. And Oscar de la Hoya, similar to normal people, have some of these issues as well. He had drug problem, marital issue, alcoholism. What's the main difference, however, is that Oscar de la Hoya, he recognized these problems that he was facing in his life. And about a few years ago, after his retirement, he actually checked himself into a drug rehabilitation center for a period of 3 months to be able to overcome some of these issues that he faced. So I'd just like to stress that money isn't simply the solution to some of the problems that we face when it comes to poverty. Rather, money is simply a means for a higher possibility of a better outcome. When we have problems, when people have problems, and when they are fortunate enough to be able to afford the best support like Oscar de la Hoya, they can get access to this support, this help if they want to. But what happens when these problems happen to people who do not have the money to be able to afford this support? In Singapore, we don't have a poverty line. In Singapore, there's no official poverty line. Our government does not think a poverty line by itself will be useful because they do not feel that simply setting a number is going to help anyone. That is true to some extent, but another way of looking at it is that without having a poverty line in place, we won't be able to actually detect what's the current situation on the ground, how many people are actually under the poverty line. More importantly, we will not be able to focus on what are the underlying issues that some of these people face. We won't be able to tell if the problem is getting better year by year, or is it actually getting worse. So that is the problem with the absence of a poverty line in Singapore. The government is also a little bit worried about what they call this a cliff effect. So basically what a cliff effect means is that, take for example, if the poverty line is set at $2,000 per month, the people who fall below the poverty line, they'll be rendered support through government agencies, through social welfare organization. What the government is afraid of is that for the people who earn just above $2,000, maybe the guy who earns $2,001, or the household that has $2,001 for his income, they won't receive any support. But I don't think that is necessarily going to be the case. I think there are ways to actually manage this problem. So take for example, remedial versus supplementary classes in schools. In schools, when we take exams, there is always a passing mark. So a passing mark of say 50. And people who do not hit the passing mark, who fails their exams, they will need to go for remedial classes. Their teachers will get them to attend some additional lessons in the afternoon. They will have to rush for these classes, as what my earlier speakers talked about, not having as much fun as they could have, so that they can improve in the next exams. But that does not mean that the students who just passed their exams, who got 50, 51, are exempted from any support. So even the students who managed scrape and pass, teachers give them attention all the time. They are also given additional help so that they can continue to progress better, do well for their next exams. So in the same manner, I think a poverty line, if instilled into Singapore, can also be managed by having various types of support given to people from various income groups. So I think I just want to end off in conclusion for my speech to just talk about the fact that even if there isn't a poverty line in Singapore, even if this doesn't change in the next 4 to 5 years, it doesn't mean that poverty isn't around us. Poverty is around us whether we see it or not, whether we believe it or not. Thank you.